Good afternoon and welcome to another webinar. This is part two, an informational webinar on the Indigenous Community Support Fund. We have folks from Indigenous Services Canada and FNHA here to answer your questions regarding that. My name is Selena Dorme. I'm the engagement coordinator for the First Nations Public Service Secretariat. I'm also from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation here in North Vancouver, but I am calling you from our offices here in West Vancouver on the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. Before we call on Vern Bob to do an opening prayer, I just would like to acknowledge tomorrow is Remembrance Day, which is why I have my poppies here in the background. And as a veteran myself, I served the United States Army for 4 years. I'd like to just acknowledge all of those who gave the ultimate sacrifice serving their country, no matter what country you're from. So I just want to acknowledge all of those who served our country and are currently serving right now. I'd like to ask Vern Bob to come online, turn on your video and audio so we can get started with the opening prayer.
Thank you, Selena. I would like to ask that everyone remain seated. If you're wearing a hat, please remove it for the moment. If you're comfortable, please shut your eyes and imagine that we're in a circle holding hands. And I also ask that we all reflect on the words being said. Creator, we thank you for this opportunity to come together to discuss a very important topic that has affected us all and all our communities. The pandemic has brought out the best in all of us, some of us, sorry, but it has also brought out the worst. We have lost people we love, and we have not hugged others for what seems like a very, very long time. We ask for patience and understanding so that we may take what we learn today and apply it for the benefit of elders, youth, and all community members. What we discuss will affect thousands of people within our bubbles and their bubbles. So we ask that decisions be made wisely. Hachka.
Thank you, Vern, for providing the prayer to get this meeting started in a really good way. I'd now like to call on Jody Caden from Indigenous Services Canada to provide some comments. Again, you're here to hear a little bit more about the Indigenous Community Support Fund, what that process looks like. So I'd like to go ahead and ask Jody to turn on her video right now.
Thank you very much, Selena. And thank you, Vern, for that beautiful prayer to start us off in such a good way. I really needed it today. I just had a little bit of a, I think an online panic attack because I felt like I didn't have all the screens set up properly for this. So I'm excited now and my adrenaline's pumping. Well, welcome to today's technical discussion on the recent launch of the request for application for funding through the Indigenous Community Support Fund. I am Jody Caden, Director of Funding Services at Indigenous Services Canada, and I'm very pleased today to be here with you, starting today's session. Before we begin, on behalf of myself and my colleagues, we want to acknowledge the land of the Coast Salish peoples, Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam nations that we have the pleasure to work from. A number of my colleagues are also participating in our session today so that they and their staff can answer as many questions as possible. And we're also very pleased to have our partner from the First Nations Health Authority here to support our technical discussion from a health perspective. Emily Dicken, Director of Emergency Management, has joined us. Thank you very much, Emily. We want to make today's session very practical and provide you with information that will help you make a successful application to access funding through the needs-based component of the Indigenous Community Support Fund. Most of our time today will be spent walking through the application form, identifying the type and level of information that we're looking for in applications, including assessment considerations, as well as providing examples of the kinds of activities that can be supported. There will also be plenty of time for questions and answers. Before we get started, I want to provide a bit of context for those of you that may not be as familiar with the Indigenous Community Support Fund or find it confusing like many of us do. This fund was created by the Government of Canada this past March as part of our COVID-19 pandemic response. In August, a lot of additional funding was announced for the Indigenous Community Support Fund to continue to support communities in preventing and controlling the spread of COVID-19. To date in BC, we've already provided $65.2 million directly to communities and Indigenous organizations through funding agreement amendments. In August, it was announced that some of the Indigenous community support funding would be available through an application process for those communities that still require additional funding support to address their COVID-19 needs. And this is the process that we're describing to you today. Before we dive into the details, it might be helpful to describe the other supports available or already implemented in your community. In addition to the Indigenous Community Support Fund, there have been funding increases in several program areas to support community needs over the last several months, such as education, income assistance, and community infrastructure for minor capital projects. Indigenous community support funding complements these other funding supports and better positions communities to respond to COVID-19. And I'm raising this here to alert you to the fact that there is a new minor capital funding allocation that is being transferred to your communities through an amendment to your funding agreement, possibly last week or this week. And this minor capital funding is separate from this application process. That minor capital funding is for building retrofits for your band offices and other community buildings. Okay, now turning our attention to the purpose of today. To begin with, we wanted to highlight that your Indigenous Community Support Fund applications must demonstrate that the planned activities will directly address a COVID-19 related need in your community. For example, funding could be used to support food security for vulnerable community members, supports for those who need to self-isolate, such as with alternate accommodations, perimeter security on reserve, and minor adaptations for buildings, for example, installing plexiglass. Although the application process closes November 30th, 2020, we encourage you to submit your application as soon as you can, because we will be reviewing applications as soon as they're received. Funding will be in all communities by December 31st, and the activities that this funding supports can continue through to March 31st. Now, just a few logistical reminders before I turn it over to our technical experts, Duncan Stephen, who's the Manager of Emergency Management, and Vern Bob, Funding Services Officer, and they're going to walk us through the application form. Now, we realize that you likely have questions during their presentation, which is great, and you may have some already, which is also great, and that's what this session is for. As Selena mentioned, we encourage you to use the Q&A function on your screen to ask your questions. Once the brief presentation is done, the rest of this time is dedicating to answering your questions to the best of our ability. And for questions that can't be answered today, we commit to getting back to folks as soon as we're able to, and we're aiming for 48 hours or less for our service standard. If you have further questions following today's discussion, please send them directly to the ISC BC Regional Office at the ISC BC COVID-19 inbox, and that email is going to be shared with you on the screen. And we've also been developing frequently asked questions and answers that incorporate questions we hear from you today, as well as those that we've heard already. And we will commit to getting that back out to everyone who participates. And the FAQ will also be included in all of the ISC updates that are regularly posted on the First Nation Public Service Secretariat website. Okay, Duncan and Vern, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jody, for sharing that. Hi, Vern. I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. We will put this link in the group chat too as well, so that you have this email address to ask your questions after the webinar. So over to you, Vern.
Okay, thank you. I'm just gonna share my screen here. And one of the things that we will immediately notice, and I'm going to refer you to the First Nation Public Service Secretariat website, and I'll lead down the path as to where we are. Hopefully you can see the screen right now. And we're going to scroll down to under new information posted. We'll see that Indigenous Community Support Fund needs-based funding application. All we have to do is click on that, and it's going to take us to the Government of Canada website, where we'll end up with the application. There we are. My computer's a little on the slow side. But as we go through, we'll note this website. A lot of it was what was in Jody's introduction. And I'm going to repeat part of that as well. And I'll repeat it because it's very important. We're going to talk about the process, who can apply, First Nations, but the real key is applications in by November 30th. And I'm going to indicate that they can be submitted at any time until that date, but funds need to be dispersed by December 31st. And the activities that would be dispersed on can be for the end of the fiscal year. So that's anything that we're planning up until March 31st. Now, it's a really short time frame to get the applications in, to get them approved, and to get the funding out the door by December 31st. There's going to have to be amendments and perhaps new funding agreements that are initiated. These need to be sent out for signature and returned by the end of the calendar year. That means signatories will need to be kicking around in December. Now, the applications themselves are going to be assessed on eligibility. They're going to be prioritized on a case-by-case basis. The number of approved applications is going to depend on a number of factors, including how many are submitted and total funding available. Now, as we go down this form, it talks about how to apply, and I'm going to get to that in a second. What I really want to bring your attention to is near the bottom of the page, where it talks about selection criteria. This is going to be an excellent reference to you as you're filling out the application. We'll talk about risk, readiness, human impact, but it's also got examples on it. So again, if we just remember to reference this information as we are going through and filling out the PDF application, you'll note there's also instructions that are involved in it, but I'm just going to pull up the PDF itself. Now, sorry, I'm losing my voice here. One of the things that I should note is it says 2021-2022 fiscal year. It should read 2020-2021. If you've got an application in already, that's fine. We will make sure that it gets reviewed and into our system. Again, need to be done by November 30th. This privacy statement is fairly self-explanatory. We'll kick on the identification, the recipient name. This is where the recipient needs to be an incorporated entity providing services to on-reserve or off-reserve folks. And incorporated entity also includes First Nations, even though the incorporation is not there. Now, in the past, if your organization has entered into a funding agreement with the department, your organization would have been assigned a recipient number, and that's what goes here. Now, if your organization in the past has not entered into an agreement with Canada yet, that's not a deterrent. We can still enter into an agreement, but it would require submission of some documentation prior to drafting up that funding agreement. That would be a certificate of good standing, confirmation of your board, and specimen signatures. And somebody from the department would reach out to your organization for that information. As we scroll down, we'll get into the contact information. And yes, again, fully beneficial to fill out all the boxes. The application information. Now, there is information that would be great to include in the proposal summary. This is where you really need to outline the risk. And that would be how the proposal addresses urgent intermediate needs for responding to an outbreak or containment efforts. We would outline the readiness, any obstacles to starting the project, staff, resources available. Is this project continuing, or is it going to be a new project? We outline the human impact, and I cannot emphasize this enough. How many individuals are going to be impacted by these activities? Is it geared towards the elders, the youth, homeless, community members? How the most vulnerable are going to be prioritized and addressed? And what is the direct benefit going to be? As we scroll down and check out the activities, you'll note that these are very broad in scope. They're largely based on the activities that were undertaken in the first round of the Indigenous Community Support Fund, where we found perimeter security, transportation, medical supplies, and all that. I just want to, before we continue on, talk about the infrastructure here for a quick second. As Jody indicated, this isn't construction of a new road or ditches. It has to be directly related to COVID, and these ones are going to be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. Down here, there is an activity listed as other. Now, the activities are broad in scope because the Indigenous Community Support Fund itself is designed to be very flexible. If there is a project, by all means, submit that project in. If you're finding a need for 2, 3 different, 4 different areas that you want to address, it may be better to submit 2, 3, 4 different projects. They're all going to be assessed within the same time frame, and they're all going to be assessed on its own merit. But it really is a way to highlight what need and what focus your community or your organization wants to undertake. And with that, oh, last question on here. Is that part of your pandemic plan? Yes or no? Pretty straightforward. I'm going to flip it over to my colleague, Duncan Stephen, and he'll continue on. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. And I'm just going to walk us through the second page of the application form, and then I have a few other comments to share. And really what we want to do, though, is open it up and make sure there's lots of time for questions. So I won't take too much time here. On page 2 of the application, what you'll see is a budget summary. And in the fillable version of the form, you can see a button there to add rows if you're needing to add additional rows for budget items. As Vern mentioned, you have the option of submitting one application that covers multiple needs, or you can submit separate applications, whatever is most convenient for your organization or community. And what's important, though, is to break down the costs according to the different activity areas. One tip is that on the funding call page that Vern brought up at the very beginning, once he navigated from the First Nations Public Service Secretariat website, there are links at the very bottom for all of the terms and conditions for the various funding programs that are being rolled up into the Indigenous Community Support Fund, so the Emergency Management Assistance Program, infrastructure, and so on. And those terms and conditions do speak to eligible costs depending on the funding stream, if that's helpful. If your proposal has multiple activities or sub-activities, it's very helpful if you can rank them in priority order, and that's just because there may be some cases where only partial funding is available. And so we want to make sure that we're focusing resources where they are most needed in terms of your highest priorities. And as Vern has shared, the number of projects and activities that can be supported will depend on the number of submissions and the needs throughout the region and indeed throughout the country. And so it's very helpful for us to understand what your order of priority is for those activities and for the initiatives you intend to undertake. In the next section, you'll see that partners can be identified, and please keep in mind that if funding is being distributed further to a partner or a third party, the allocation method should be identified. That can be in the project description if that's the easiest place to capture that allocation method. Otherwise, if you want to indicate partners that you're working alongside and what their involvement would be, this is obviously the place to do that. Under other government funding, this is where you would indicate if you've received or requested any other government funding to support the needs identified. You can then indicate whether the outcome is known for that funding. So for example, if you've applied for a grant, but you're not sure whether that's certain yet, you can identify here that that funding is certain or uncertain. The other thing is that some communities, well, all communities, I should say, all First Nations and some organizations may have received previous Indigenous Community Support Fund allocations. And so this is where you can indicate that funding. And again, the needs-based funding process is intended for needs that are over and above or outside what can be accommodated within previous funding or allocation. So you would just want to make it clear here that this is indeed for needs that extend beyond the funding that's already been received, if that's applicable. Down below in the next section, you'll see where it speaks to supporting documents. And one thing I really want to stress is that we've tried to streamline the application as much as possible. So really all that is required is the completed application form, ideally with as much information on the needs and the criteria in terms of the COVID risk, readiness, human impact, and prior funding. If there are existing supporting documents that you wish to include, and that could be some indication of support from a partner, it could be your pandemic or emergency plan, or it could be other documents that illustrate the need. For example, one community shared with our department the results of a survey that had been done with community members around the needs that they were facing in the context of COVID. And you're welcome to include that kind of information, but there is no requirement for additional information. And there's definitely no requirement for, you know, a 30-page desktop published proposal. Really, the application form with the information that's being requested is sufficient for our needs. At the very, very bottom, we have the declaration, and this should be completed by somebody who is authorized on behalf of your community or organization. Please keep in mind that we may also need to reach out either to the authorized representative indicated here or to the representative who submits the application, just to clarify if there's questions, for example, around budget items or around activities and what's included, to ensure that we can move your applications through this process as quickly as possible. Just to recap, Applications for the needs-based process will be accepted up to and including November 30th. There is no need to wait. So for example, if you have already identified a need, for example, for a public health checkpoint or perimeter security, you could submit your application for that stream and then continue to develop your application for other funding streams, for example, if you choose to submit multiple applications. Applications will be assessed for eligibility and prioritized on a case-by-case basis. And again, that's why we really want to understand the context in your community and in relation to the criteria that we've mentioned a few times, as well as what your priorities are. And while specific subject headings aren't included in the application, you could actually take the 4 criteria, the COVID risk, the readiness, and the other 2 that are listed there on the website, human impact and prior funding, and actually include those as headings in your project description if that's helpful. For perimeter security, I do want to mention that one, and that's specific to public health checkpoints on reserve. We are adopting the approach that the First Nations Health Authority has developed for consistency. So that looks like eligible costs within a up to 48 billable hours within a 24-hour period. So essentially for 2 positions plus eligible costs. And that can involve access control in and out of community, as well as the dissemination of up-to-date public health information. I will paste the link in case it's not already there in the chat for the FNHA's Community Support Guide, which outlines that approach. And again, just for clarity, we are adopting the same approach for consistency's sake. Our staff will be working to make the review process as efficient and as streamlined as possible. And as I mentioned, we may have to reach out to you. While we will have an opportunity for questions today, you are also welcome to submit questions. And Jody shared the email address at the very, very beginning of the webinar. So if you have additional questions after you've had a chance to digest this information, please feel free to reach out to us and we will get back to you as quickly as possible. And with that, I think I'd like to hand it back and hopefully we can open it up for questions.
Thank you both so much, Vern and Duncan, for running through the application process. The group chat has been very busy during your presentation, so I encourage everybody to scroll through the group chat because our panelists have been answering questions as Duncan and Vern were running through the application process. So just quickly doing that, again, I want to reiterate, you can use the Q&A button to submit your question. That can be found at the bottom of your screen. You can click on the participants list and raise the blue hand to ask your question live. So go ahead and do that now if you'd like to ask a question live. But again, there's a lot of chatter going on in the group chat with questions, and some of our panelists have been answering those questions. So perhaps maybe you have an answer in there. There was one specifically that was not answered, which I'm trying to scroll back up and find. What would be considered an incremental employee support that would be eligible for funding?
So maybe I'll jump in on that one. There could be a few scenarios. It could be that additional staff are required, and so you may need to hire a position, for example, and that would be as a new position incremental. It might be that there's overtime that existing non-health positions, and this is really focused on the non-health positions, might need to do as part of emergency operations or coordination. So overtime could be eligible. It might be if you have part-time staff that are now working more hours that you need to increase the number of hours. And again, that would be considered incremental. We've also seen scenarios where existing staff within, say, a First Nation or a community organization are reassigned, and then their positions might be backfilled for continuity. And so that would create an incremental cost. It's almost as if you're hiring for a new position in that scenario. So those are some examples, but I think you know, if you have a specific situation, feel free to reach out to us via the email address or submit your application and we can review it because it is case by case as well.
Great. Thank you both so much. I'm going to move to questions that want to be asked live. So John Lewis, if you could please unmute yourself and please let us know where you're calling from, your organization or your community, and go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, hello everyone. My name is John Lewis. I'm with the Carriacou County Tribal Council in Prince George, BC, where it's snowing a little bit. don't know how it is where you're at, but we're getting snow. We've submitted an application before, and I did get some clarification on some of your dialogue here. Like I think what I need to do is resend an amendment there, because I would like to amend the budget part. I'm sure that's doable, and to allow more room in the budget for the extra staffing that we've had here. And I didn't quite answer I answered it where it wasn't quite clear as to if we've had different proposals or anything like that submitted before. And I just said no, but up above I said that we did receive funding in the past. So I'm not sure who I would talk to. I guess just somebody, whoever I submitted the proposal to, I guess, with regard to amending the budget piece and making those minor adjustments there. And thank you for the funding. It's great stuff. It's definitely helping a lot. We're getting a lot of good feedback here from the first round that we got from you guys. So the people that are at the grassroots level are very appreciative of it.
Thank you, John, for asking your question. I'll turn it over to our panelists. Vern, did you? Oh, or Duncan?
So if I understand the question correctly, can you amend your budget? Definitely.
And so I think my suggestion would be simply to send the amended application through to the email address the same way that you submitted the first application, and then maybe just note that this is a revision of the initial application, and we can swap those out. If you have any questions that you would like us to follow up with, we can also reach back based on that.
Great, thank you so much. Next person asking a live question, Ashley Heathcliff. Please unmute. Let us know where you're calling from.
Good afternoon. This is Juan Cedeño and Ashley Heathcliff from Natalie Within First Nation. Good afternoon to everyone. Our question is in relation to one of the activities in the proposal, which is the login and accommodation. But before we raise the question or discuss our ideas, I would like to start by saying that we reside in a community where we have 2 hotels, rundown hotels, if I may say so, without insulting anybody. One hotel is tied into a bar. The other one is tied into a restaurant. And there is no safety health precautions in either of these hotels. Over and above that, our community has a self-isolation policy whereby if one of our members or staff members or community members leave the community or return from an area where there is known cases of COVID, those community members or staff members are required to self-isolate for 14 days. Now, as you probably understand very well the situation in our communities, we have overcrowded conditions and we cannot expect one adult coming into a home with 1 bathroom, with shared bedrooms, and be able to self-isolate. So our options are dual. We have 2 options here. Number 1, we send our community member to self-isolate in a rundown hotel where they most likely going to contaminate other people or they're going to get even sicker. And number 2, we can look at what the First Nation Health Authority has suggested, and that is to provide RV accommodations. So our question has to do with the fact that we are leaning towards purchasing RVs, recreational vehicles, used ones, of course. We're not going to be buying top of the lines or $100,000 units, but we are looking at purchasing RVs so that we can self-isolate our community members under the guidance and care of our health staff. So my question, and I'm sorry about being so extensive about this question, but my question is, will that be the purchase of the RVs, will that be an acceptable budget items under this application? Thank you. And the question I'm directing directly to Duncan, if I may so.
For sure. And Juan, it's nice to hear your voice. Unfortunately, it likely wouldn't be eligible directly under the Indigenous Community Support Fund, simply because we're using the terms and conditions of the Emergency Management Program for some of the costs, and minor capital only is eligible. This would be viewed as major capital. And then on the infrastructure side, the capital, as I understand it, is really centered on minor adaptations to existing spaces in order to better support safety and COVID-related protocols. So I guess the one other thing, though, that I should emphasize is that we are working very closely with the First Nations Health Authority, and they do have the lead around supporting approaches for isolation planning and those kinds of things. So, you know, certainly what we would want to do is work with you and work with the FNHA to be as creative as possible when it comes to options around those very, very important needs. And Emily, I see you come off mute, so maybe I'll pass that to you.
For sure. And hi, Juan. Through the FNHA supports, that would definitely fall into the space of community isolation supports. And we can definitely work through our regional team in the north to support what that different pathway would look like, and how to kind of support you in developing and building out those isolation spaces and community.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you're here, Emily, because initially Chief Larry Nuski from our community sent a letter directly to Mr. Richard Jock, explaining the situation and requesting the support to purchase these units. Now, unfortunately, Mr. Jock seems to be a very busy person and hasn't replied to the chief. Hopefully he will take some time, but we will send a letter to your attention, Emily, or somebody else if you suggest that, and we'll explain the situation, and we will also make the case for doing a budget assessment, cost-benefit analysis, because if we start sending our community members to the local hotels, it's going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of about $2,500 a person every time we send them there. And we are risking getting other people contaminated, and we are risking getting our community members even more sick. So my feedback to FNHA is that when FNHA suggested the use of RVs or isolation areas or isolation spaces, the suggestion, as I recall, was made when there was already an outbreak in a community. And we're not going to wait until there is an outbreak in our community. And I'm glad that Indigenous Services Canada is moving towards working on preventative measures and not just reacting to the situations, and consider that emergency management is about response only. We need to start thinking outside the box and start looking at the options that will allow us to better protect our communities. And at the end of the day, the costs associated with our ideas will be the same or lower, Duncan. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for Duncan and Emily for responding to that. We do only have about 20 minutes for Q&A, so please I encourage you to keep your questions brief and concise. As always, the Indigenous Services Canada team will follow up with everybody who is asking their questions in the group chat if there's anything that we missed and or if there's any follow-up. So we do understand that these are all very specific scenarios. The questions are coming in, so I just want to raise that to everybody. Fern, did you want to add anything? or?
Oh, no, not at this point.
Okay. Next up is Teresa. So can you please turn on your audio and let us know where you're calling from?
Hi, good morning. Yes, this is Teresa Boyce with Coquitlam First Nation. It's good to see you all. My question is regards to, there was another person that asked a question about amending his budget. So my thought was around, okay, we're putting the application in now so we can backdate it back to April then and redo our budget, like some of the security items which we weren't putting, which we hadn't thought about into adding, and some of the other, like, you know, there's another range of different things that are kind of falling within the emergency management for COVID. So that, just making sure that I have it clear that we're able to re-add this to the budget and just, you know, make sure that it's, and how far we're able to go back on it. So that was my question, basically.
Thank you, Teresa.
Yeah, I'll take a first shot at this. I would suggest that these activities are, from this point going forward, it's recognized that there are costs that communities and organizations have incurred to date. And a lot of that is going to be the basis of your proposal as they come in. One of the recommendations that I'm going to make is you may also want to wish to talk to your funding services officer in regards to budgets and how this all plays out and how much has been incorporated into various funding agreements so far in this fiscal year and their intended uses. Because that would be a good starting place on going forward.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right, thank you.
Oh, sorry about that. I muted you a little too soon. Thanks, Teresa, for your question. Again, as I mentioned, the group chat and the Q&A dialogue box has been very busy. So there are answered questions that have been typed in by our panelists. So if you open your Q&A dialogue box, there's 3 different columns or 2 different columns. There's an open question that has not been answered, and then there's an answered column. So we have about 7 questions there regarding whether or not you can use your funds or backdate, I would say backdate some of the expenses, what the time period is. It is only eligible to apply until November 30th, between October 30th and November 30th, and that funds do have to be spent by March 31st, 2021. One of the other questions, we just move on to the group chat if there are no other folks that want to ask their question live. Sorry, it's very busy here. We addressed the security perimeter. Let's see. There's one of our, you guys are too efficient for me. Next question is transportation and our medical transportation has increased, and we have people using their own vehicles. So this can fund help with purchasing. Can this fund help with purchasing a medical vehicle?
I'm not seeing anyone jump in on this one, so maybe I will. We would see medical transport as being more a conversation with the First Nations Health Authority, so that would probably be the space to have the conversation. If there are additional transportation needs, transportation is absolutely eligible within the needs-based process outside of health service delivery. It probably wouldn't look like a vehicle purchase, again, because that would be viewed as major capital, but rental may be eligible, for example, in order to meet a transportation need, or there might be other options. We're willing to be as possible within the terms and conditions. And Emily, I'll hand it back over to you.
Sure thing. Sorry, I was struggling with my buttons. So we've seen this request come through multiple times over the COVID period, and for us at FNHA, this has been deemed an ineligible expense. We really look to BC EHS, BC Ambulance to be providing this service, recognizing that there are gaps at the community level, oftentimes with BC Ambulance service and challenges there. And so we're happy to support communities in terms of strengthening that conversation or helping to elevate or escalate that conversation and try to bring that need closer to the community. But at this time, it was determined that the purchase of vehicles didn't fit into the space of COVID eligibility for FNHA for the purposes of medical transport. We can support, though, slight retrofitting of personal vehicles to be used to transport folks for testing or other aspects of kind of non-emergent, non-urgent medical care in community, and that can be done through retrofitting with plexiglass and other things to make to uphold spaces of public health within vehicles, but not for that space of emergent or urgent care.
Thank you both so much. Next question in the group chat is, can Indigenous nonprofits operating off reserve apply for funding?
The answer is, okay, I'll throw it out. The answer is yes. This application process is open to all, on reserve, off reserve. The key is that it's an incorporated entity providing services to either on or off reserve First Nations. Thank you.
Thank you. My panelists are a little too efficient. I go to ask the question and see it's already been answered. Anybody else who wants to ask their question live, again, please click on the participants list. Mariah Charlson, please unmute.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. Really happy to be a part of discussion today, and I'm phoning in from Snuneymuxw territory, but I represent Nuu-chah-nulth Tribal Council. So I just had a question. I heard in Vern's, when he mentioned vulnerable populations, and understanding that as Nuu-chah-nulth we have 14 nations, and roughly 80% of our population of 10,000 live off reserve. So we're really happy to see this fund available to off reserve. And many of our people do live and they sleep rough. So we have a high population of homeless people, for example, who are in that off reserve demographic. And I'm wondering if you guys could provide some examples of successful applicants that have actually met the need and have been successful in assisting the vulnerable populations. Because I know, for example, traditional foods, really difficult one for anybody to have access to, in particular our vulnerable populations. And I was curious if harvesting as well as distributing the food, particularly to our vulnerable populations off reserve, would be an eligible expense under this fund. Thank you.
Want me to jump in?
Go ahead.
Hi, Mariah, it's Catherine Lapa. I would say there's a number of measures that we're trying to do for the urban and off-reserve populations, and not all of them are entirely with Indigenous Services Canada's responsibilities. But a number of other partners are trying to contribute as well, both funding to food banks, but also funding specific to homeless shelters. So there are some additional supports beyond the Indigenous Communities Support Fund. But certainly food security related issues like you're suggesting, harvesting of traditional food supplies and distribution would be something that we could consider under this, whether for on reserve members or off reserve members. So we can certainly provide you with additional information, but we certainly recognize that this is an area that communities are really craving for in one way or another, and so we're happy to work with you on that. And we can certainly try and find some examples where there have been good supports provided. As you can imagine, everyone is struggling in the best way possible as well to get food to people when they're largely doing virtual delivery and can't do sort of the in-person meals that they might have in the past. So groups are, really trying to be creative in terms of either providing food supplies to people's individual homes or delivering meals, various approaches to things. And as I say, we recognize that food security, particularly on the traditional food side, continues to be a high priority.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Moving on to the next question, we just have about 5 minutes left in the Q&A from Navgeese. We have members that have boats and travel up and down the coast to avoid crowds. Our docks need lights, particularly solar lights. Can this funding assist with installation of solar lights for our docks and make our docks more secure, as well with installing a gate?
So I think actually this question highlights one thing, and that is that definitely as an employee of Indigenous Services Canada, we're not going to be able to anticipate the full range of needs that might come to the fore through this process. And so we would encourage any community or organization to put forward applications and articulate what those needs are, because again, as I say, we're not going to be able to predict the full extent of needs. Under the emergency management stream, minor capital is eligible on reserve. And so if, for example, that was a dock within a community on reserve where that the lights and gate were things that you wanted to put in place, I think the key thing would be to just ensure that you're really clear in your application around what the link is to reducing the risk of COVID and articulate how that measure is going to help with that. And then it's definitely something we could look at.
Thank you so much. One more question from the Q&A, and then we will move on to Merv, who wants to ask their question live. Roy Speaks from Lytton First Nation. Hi, Roy. Hope you're doing well. For isolation support, is home care aid worker time and travel to provide that support eligible under the funding? And what about harm reduction supplies for people living with addictions?
Duncan, maybe I'll pick this one up. So there are harm reduction supports eligible through FNHA. What I will do is, I'm not the most tech savvy person, but I'll cut and paste the FNHA community support guide into the chat function. And in there, you'll find harm reduction supports under our mental health and wellness, as well as our mental health and substance abuse supports specifically for COVID.
And maybe one more quick point is that we are working very, very closely with FNHA. So if you're not sure, you don't have to do the work of navigating between our two systems. If we receive an application that fits more with the health service delivery piece, we will work with FNHA to identify the appropriate pathway. So don't worry too much if navigating between the systems can get a little confusing. We realize that.
Thank you both so much. I'd now like to ask Merv to unmute so that you can ask your question.
Hi, I'm Merv Thomas. I'm the CEO of Circle of Eagles Lodge Society in Vancouver. And we did apply to ISC and we did get some funds. Thank you for that. My question is that since COVID hit, we've had some staff. We operate 2 halfway houses. We have staff that have some staff have opted to go on medical leave because they just could not handle the stress of the pandemic, and so we've lost staff. And we've had some staff that have carried on, and we did have COVID in our house. One of our the brothers that lived in one of our halfway houses got sick, and we've also had a staff person sick as well. So it has been very close to us. But the question I've got is just to try and keep the staff and as I know that the numbers are going up high right now, but is danger pay an eligibility under this pot? For us, we have not been eligible to apply for any danger pay through the province, and any other federal programs were not eligible. So I'm just wondering if it would be eligible under this stream.
Hi, Merv. I'm not totally sure if definitely don't have an answer in this exact moment. What I would have to do is work with our regional team and kind of understand the point of service delivery that you are providing. I think sometimes the point of support looks a little bit different if there's a service agreement in place with FNHA, and then how those services transition kind of under those space of agreements. But I'm definitely happy to follow up after the call, and we can go back and forth by email if that's helpful. Selena, I'm wondering, do you have everybody's contact info if we want to do follow up?
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll follow up with you right after the call.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much. There were a couple of questions on where to find this recording. I've just posted the YouTube channel for the First Nations Public Service Secretariat. So once this webinar ends, a recording is available. We do post it there typically on the same day. Last week's webinar is also up there, along with all of our other nation-to-nation sharing and other ISC town halls that we've done. So the link is in the group chat. You can also access it through just going on our website too as well. And of course, as Emily mentioned, we do pull a report and have all your contact information for those who have joined today. So if there are outstanding questions, you can of course email your question that to the email address that was provided specifically by ISC, but they will also get a copy of all the questions that were asked and any of those that were unanswered during this webinar. It is now 2 o'clock. We are at the end of our hour. Questions, lots of busy group chat and Q&A and live questions for this one. We have 164 people on this call right now. So I'm going to wrap up. I want to thank again all of our panelists for joining and providing some instructions for First Nations on how to access the next pot of money that's going out to support our communities in need. And I want to thank all of you for joining us this afternoon. And that's it. I raise my hands to all of you and all the good work. Bye.